Thank you for everyone who come for today's talk. I will try to keep the talk today kind of brief because I know there is some event happening 5 o'clock. So today's title is Inhabiting the Absence of Mediation. But I think this title is more like my proposition rather than a conclusion about the reality of institutional practice in China. On the contracts, what I'm going to talk about today can be regarded as counter-institutional practice in China, which is quite different from the majority of museum or private museum and national museum practice at the moment in China. But I will also start to talk from the exhibition I curated last year in September, which Alice also mentioned, titled A Museum That Is Not, more like a reflexive entry point of my personal insights about institution and its practice in China. This is not just an image which is used on the cover of the publication of this exhibition, The Museum That Is Not, but it's also the landscape outside of Times Museum, because Times Museum, if anyone have the catalog of the Second Guangzhou Triennale in the hands, you might be able to see Times Museum was part of the Delta Laboratory project during the Second Guangzhou Triennial, and it was curated by Hou Hanru and Hans-Ulrich Obrist. And actually, Kuhas was very interested in the urbanization process of the Pearl River Delta. And from this image, you can almost see like a vivid mirror of what is happening in the past 10 years, as well as what might be happening in the coming 10 years in China. From the left side of the image, you can see a whole bunch of real estate buildings, which is the main kind of residential architecture in China. And the green area is some abandoned films that no more farmers are working on them. And also you can see a main road is being built at the moment, and it's expected to finish in the coming 2 or 3 years. And also there is the blue cover thing there. It's actually a metro subway station, which just arrived at the door of the museum at the end of 2010. So that's exactly when this museum opened to the public. Because before, this area is northern Guangzhou, but it's still a suburbia area, which is at the border of the city. And to travel from downtown Guangzhou to the museum is quite a big deal. Without the metro station or the subway connected the city to the museum, we won't be able to welcome that many public. So, and at the right side of the picture, which you cannot see from the image here, is like there are still some warehouses, which I think in the future will be transformed into other functions. And so this picture was actually taken from the terrace of Times Museum. And you might wonder where is it located? So this museum is located on top of a 18-floor residential building, and that is actually very much the core of Kuha's idea of the architecture, because they want the museum to be an intervention of the everyday life. And during the Second Guangzhou Triennale, the architecture was more or less finished 2 years after, and the whole realization of this project is solely funded by Times Group, which is a real estate group in Guangzhou. And actually, real estate group are one of the main proponents in China to support the opening of some private museums and also institutions. I might work on that a bit later and give you some example. And you can see from the architecture, there are 2 big glass rooms, which is also part of Kuha's concept. And And it's in the summertime, it's almost like 2 greenhouses. And Guangzhou is in southern China, which is subtropical weather. And so we have like 8 to 10 months of summertime of 35, 34 degrees in most days. So this is quite a challenging venue to work with, actually. We do also have an office area which is located on the 14th floor of the whole building. And when we go to work every day or get off every day, we'll smell people cooking. Or sometimes if we work overtime at night, you can also hear the neighbors fighting or something. So, and this is some image might give you a bit more idea of the actual space. So you can see the space itself is not really in the conventional meaning as a neutral white cube, because there are big windows, and also it's like overlighted by sun during whole summertime. And also you can, from the big windows, you can see the landscape of the neighbor buildings, and you can overlook the garden of the nearby community, which is called Rose Garden. Rose Garden. So this is the classroom, one of the classrooms. And from this picture, you can have a better idea of this so-called interventional structure of the residential building. And you can also see maybe more information from the catalog there. And at the beginning, Ku has tried to envision it as a site for production, artist production. So he did design apartments for artist residency, and also a basement which can be used in the future as a workshop for artists to produce work. But in the end, because Guangzhou is a relatively peripheral area in terms of contemporary art production, which is like Beijing mostly, and also there is not a very sustainable art market and art infrastructure in Guangzhou. So this whole idea of production became more or less a gesture rather than more or less like a concrete result. So we are still trying to envision what can be this museum, and that is part of the reason why I initiated this project called Museum That Is Not last year, and try to explore what exactly is a museum in a context that also towards the audience that have no awareness of museum history, and also a museum that doesn't really have any social political background about public institution. And it's actually quite a contradictory example. And so here is basically all of my brief introduction of the background of Times Museum as well as part of the project. But if you don't mind, I'm gonna read some text from the curatorial statement of this project, which after this I will give you some pictures, and you can see works by the artists, and some events happened during the exhibition period. So when I first began working for the Times Museum, many couriers would call me, and even when they had arrived to the right building, and they would ask, where exactly is your museum located? So I found the most effective way to communicate where we are is to mention our neighbor. Do you see the bank? Yes, the green one. The museum is right next to it. And on the second day of our opening, my colleague who was in charge of the exhibition hall called me requesting my help. And they said so many people are touching the works. Should we try and stop them? So what makes a bank more identifiable than a museum? Why would an artwork, as opposed to a fashion TV set in a shop, provoke the impulse to touch? If we resort to the conventional mode of thinking, we will posit something like, okay, the fundamental difference between a bank and a museum is blah, 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 and then proceed to educate our audience. So one day they will behave properly in a museum, in an institution, and also know how to appreciate certain artworks. But what does the museum signify within the context of contemporary China and for the general public? It has served both ornamental and instrumental roles in the modernization process of China. For us who have never experienced the historical struggle of Western museums, we seem to be talking about a tradition that we ourselves never really embraced, or an obsession we don't really care about. Whom are we defending for and resisting against? So that's why I kind of jump directly to one of the side events of the museum that is not, which kind of reflect the real context or instant context of contemporary China. Within the 7 weeks of a museum that is not, we organize 4 open studio series, which is all local events extend outside of the museum venue and reach out to the local residents and local community, and also kind of explore possibilities of communication, exactly as what I mentioned in the title. What is the role of an institution being the mediator or curator being the cultural producers? So this is one event called the Yellowside Daily. It's actually a newspaper organized. This event is organized by Home Shop. Home Shop is an artist initiative located in Beijing. Then I asked them to come to the neighborhood of Times Museum and stay for 2 weeks to research on the local neighborhood. So they proposed this idea to release a fake newspaper, which is called Yellowside Daily. Yellowside is the neighborhood of Times Museum. In Chinese, it means Huangbian. So they released this newspaper based on substantial research of the local community, and then project, instead of reporting what had happened, they project what will happen after 2 or 3 days. So this whole Yellowside Daily is more or less is part of a residential project, as well as more or less an experiments with what can be claimed as newspaper, because mass media in China signify of authority, which means it's from government. There are no private newspaper in China. So this newspaper also is illegal in a way. And then on the day of the news day of Yellowside Daily, members and participants of Home Shop invite the local residents to work together with him. From this picture, you can see some ladies wearing black dress with red collar. Actually, they're a dancing group of the Yellowside community, and they usually have problem to rehearse in the public space because the local residents will kind of accuse them being too noisy. So in the Yellowside Daily event, we invite this local dancing group to work together on the opening of the launching opening of the Yellowside. So we kind of play with the concept of what is the public space, what is mass media, what exactly is newspaper, and can we have our own newspaper in this small neighborhood? And we print around 5,000 to 5,000 newspaper and send out to everyone in the nearby neighborhood. So here is also one image of one of the Newsday events. We work with local motorbike riders we pay them for 2 hours work, and then they can offer free rides for the local residents from the museum entrance to the Yellowside village, which is at the other end of the road. So that is part of our idea to offer service to the public to the neighborhood, and also explore what is the relationship between the museum and the local residents. If we look at those people, they are more or less can be regarded as counter-public of an institution. Because when you see the pictures of Times Museum, it gave some kind of exclusive feeling that people might feel intimidated to walk into. So instead of forcing them to come inside, we would like to show our friendly gesture. And that's part of the project we do during the exhibition. And I have many times introduced the concept of the exhibition to my colleagues and fellow art practitioners and even the audience. And actually what is relevant in the Western museum history can rarely bring up resonance from Chinese audience as well as peers, because this whole idea of institution is still quite not there. And as for museum infrastructure in China, it's only two kind of models. One is national-owned museums, which only got funding from the government or local government or the Cultural Bureau. And there are no public funding available for any visual art or contemporary institution to apply for. And the majority of museums are actually supported by real estate corporations, banks, insurance company, and also some of those were funded by private collectors. And I will give you one or two examples at the end of the talk so that you can have some idea. So when I research on the history of museum in China, and also there are not that many publications in Chinese which are available about museumology as well. So this whole development about the institution after, such as in the history of institutional critique or new institutionalism, or the concept of Kunsthalle, like in Europe, are not recognized in China. So how to communicate this idea of a museum when ourselves it's actually perform as a museum that is not really a museum? And this whole exhibition become a performative statement about all the museums that are not, and all the museums that will never be in China. And that might sound like a bold statement, but I'm not sure museums in China will evolve into something or go through the same path as Western museum through the same kind of history. So this whole project is also my own proposition about this question. So in the exhibition, we have 5 artworks, which can be looked at as more like conventional thematic group show. And this is one of the work. It's titled Sanchez Museum. This artist, he used to live and study in Guangzhou, in the Art Academy of Guangzhou. So he had a very substantial connection with the city of Guangzhou. But now he already moved to Beijing. The reason also is partly because Beijing has a more sustainable system and also have a more developed commercial gallery system for young artists as Hu Xiangqian. He might be able to develop a career as a professional artist in Beijing rather than in Guangzhou. But I invite him to come back to present this immaterial museum, which is almost take the form of a one-man show. He is the only staff as well as the director of this Xiangqian Museum, and he will describe with his language as well as body language what are the collections within this museum. So in this piece, it's actually the third opening of Xiangqian Museum. He already did this project before in Beijing and also, I think, in Manchester in the UK. But this time, he chose to respond to some earlier artworks which gave him influence when he develop his artistic practice in the earlier years. So he reflect on an art piece of big-tailed elephant. I don't know whether Alice might know, like they're very important artist group in the 90s, initiated by artists from the Pearl River Delta. And also, it's the first time he presents his work in a real public space, which will attract attention from random passers-by instead of informed art audience. So he stands directly in front of the museum and facing the busy street with motorbikes and cars and old ladies going to shop in the market, and the whole performance lasted for 20 minutes. And it's on the closing day of a museum that is not. And on the opening, only the sign of Sanchez Museum was installed and available for the audience. This is another work by an artist group from Shanghai called Museum of Unknown. One of the more prominent artists is Qiu Anxiong, and because they're interested in this concept of museum and as well as interdisciplinary understanding of what can be a museum. So I think their work kind of delivers some gesture of relational aesthetic, if I'm honest. But we set this art piece on the first floor of the museum, which usually seem a bit cold and metallic. And because we haven't found the ideal partner for bookshops or a cafe, so the feeling for most people who walk into the museum is a bit cold and don't know what's happening, because they need to take the elevator to the 19th floor, then they can see the actual show. So we installed this kind of almost make the first floor a bit messy with all kinds of uncertain everyday objects which had been transformed by the artists, and you can almost feel some kind of craftsmanship when they put a lot of light bulbs on the table, and then also change a chair into something that you don't know, you cannot sit on. And they also collected a lot of, at that time they were very interested in the relationship between science and art. So they also bought a lot of science books and put on a bookshelf and a couch and some kind of meeting space for people who just step into the museum or finish seeing the show, and so they can sit down and maybe talk. So, and they also include all these plants, reorganize the plants of the museum and kind of make a friendly environment for people to sit down. And after we just went through the entrance of the museum and then the lobby, the first floor of the museum, and now we reach on the 19th floor, which look like a very beautiful but kind of unique, have strong character white cube. And in the 19th floor, we reproduced a museum, a modern museum of modern art. Here is the Chinese meaning Museum of Modern Art, but it's actually an original size reproduction of the founding exhibition, Cubism and Abstract Art in 1936, which is hosted in MoMA and curated by Alfred Bard. And you can see some of the texts on this painting were already translated into Chinese. And all these original size paintings were painted and produced by local artists. And you can even see the Chinese signature on Duchamp's fountain. Here you can see a diagram which is drew by Alfred Bard, and it became almost the founding diagram about the history of modernism. And I think this is very important because most people who kind of became professional artists or were interested in art, our first exposure to art is a whole bunch of art history books on modernism. And usually art academy or school, if they have any art history courses, it will stop before 1945. So for us, for a lot of people who kind of grew up in the 80s or who were born in the 70s, art means modern art. Art history means modern art history. It's very much almost like deeply rooted in some Chinese artist practice. You can still, in the earliest stage of like 1985 New Wave, and also the concept of modern art is very much there, but mixed with influence from conceptual art and what we call contemporary art at the moment. So I introduced this work more or less to propose a reimagination of what exactly is art history, and to remind everyone, or because a lot of art historians in China now are really eager to define what is the past 20 years of Chinese modern art history, and it's almost like an area of power game and competition. So instead of competing on defining or writing what is the art history, we should maybe take a distance to look at what exactly is history. And history is always just one version of the whole story. This reproduction is actually a new commission by Museum of American Art in Berlin. It's a pseudo institution, I would say, because they do have a venue in Berlin, and there are no artists behind this Museum of American Art in Berlin. They do have technicians, which I think is the artist, how he called himself. And in terms of discussion and interview and also public lecture, they have a spokesman, which always name Walter Benjamin. And so beside this reproduction, we actually hosted a lecture by Walter Benjamin. But this whole lecture is titled The Unmaking of Art, is more or less the reflection of how museums became, how artifacts became artworks, and how museums were formed in the Western history. And then we actually hire a Chinese voice actor to read the text written by Museum of American Art in Berlin, but then under the title of Walter Benjamin. And we hosted this lecture at the opening of a museum that is not within this whole reproduction of Museum of Modern Art. So it's quite a complicated narrative. But so after this is the 19th floor venue, we separated into two spaces. One is for the Museum of Modern Art, which I already introduced. And then the other space, after the discussion with artist Liu Ding, he's a young artist based in Beijing, and we decided to keep the right side, the other side of the venue extremely empty, so that we can bring up some kind of contrasts compared with this condensed, packed modernism room, and then of this small, relatively empty and vague contemporary area. And his piece is titled Museum and Me, but it's composed with several art pieces, which they are mostly untitled, and the artist developed through his career as an artist. So you can see from the picture here at the left side, there is a letter he sent to Zhang Wei and Hu Fang. I don't know any of you here heard about Vitamin Creative Space, which is a very important gallery and function almost as an institution at the earliest stage of founding. It's very important for in Chinese art circus. So he wrote a letter to Zhang Wei and Hu Fang on their wedding. And then he also designed some of those, 4 of those yellow benches as commission from Times Museum. At the beginning, the museum wanted to put those benches in some public space, such as the terrace and the corridor, for the public to sit down and have a rest. but also at that time I was discussing with some of the colleagues in the museum and see what can we put those benches. And surprisingly, some of my colleagues objected the idea to put benches within the exhibition space. And the reason is they don't want people to come in and just enjoy the air conditioning. So to kind of think of, so I told Liu Ding about this story, and we decided to invite people to come in and just sit down and enjoy the air conditioning, as well as maybe they get a chance to look at their own life, because from this big window, people can actually see the neighborhood and everyday life, and they can sit down and maybe somehow to look back into their everyday life. So that's the whole story behind this yellow benches. And we also have this black and white re-edited video by Liu Ding. It's a private gift he gave to a collector. So from here, you might be able to imagine how a Chinese represent his role or position in the art circus. And it's very much institutions are absent. So they gain support or they survive solely on selling works to collectors and work closely with commercial galleries. And mid-career artists as Liu Ding had never have solo exhibition in any museum yet. So all of his solo exhibitions were hosted in commercial galleries. So in this work, which titled Museum and Me, although there are not that many museums present in the concept, it's actually a vivid reflection of how Chinese artists interpret or understand the art system in China. So at the end of this whole space, there is maybe one conversational video which can be categorized as more like institutional critique kind of endeavor. The artist invited me to join in a improvisational conversation with him. And we invite all the volunteers of the museum to sit down together to develop open discussion. And the whole 1 and 40 minutes video is not edited and it wasn't cut at all. And we just put this conversation in the space. The last work of the exhibition of a museum that is not is an old work from Wilfredo Pietro titled Mute. It's a mute and silent discotheque. This work had been realized before in Canada, actually in 2006 in McMaster Museum. And at that time it was a size-specific commission, of course. And in the interview, Wilfredo mentioned that why he got this feeling, because he's thinking to reflect on to make this discotheque as a performative piece, performative installation. Only when the audience step into the space, the meaning of the whole installation will start to be effective. And the room that we provided for Wilfredo to be transformed into a dark room is one of the glass room. And before you have almost like 180 degree or 360 degree of view of the city, and now we transform it into a dark room and became a discotheque. And because a lot of the audience who come to Times Museum, they might then not really new audience. They have came here before. So I would like to provide this kind of almost surprise to the possibility of spatial transformation, and also challenge what is a museum space. What can it be, and what are the other possibilities? So that was all about the show, the exhibition. But beside the exhibition, I just mentioned the Yellowside Daily was one of the events we developed as part of the Open Studio series. And then the top picture is the talk of Walter Benjamin. So this young Chinese guy, he's a voice actor who's very professional. He did all kind of recording for something like Discovery Channel or something. So he has a very nice voice. And then you can also see from the picture at the right side, it's a second-hand TV shop, which we own a small shop space beside the museum. So we offer this space to Chart Contemporary, which is a duo curatorial group from Beijing. They're both American, but they have been working in China for a long time. So they have this called Open House Project, which usually deal with the real estate concept of China. So they will go to real estate agents to look for temporary space that they can rent and which is located usually within the residential area. And they will develop more or less solo project with young artists who are from secondary cities, but not major cities. So this project, they invited a Hunan artist who is located in Guangzhou and work with him to develop this second-hand TV shop. And some of his work you can see is actually miniature of some daily space. One of it is studio, and some of the big TV back there is actually 4 families put together. He make all kinds of miniature of the whole environment of a family's house. And the right side is a miniature of exactly this shop. So we opened this second-hand shop to the local public, and we even have an official opening. Like most of the small shops in China, we have the lion dance and all kinds of friendly things happen, and invite a lot of neighbors step inside. And even in the end, I think we sold 3 TVs. And that's the other project we developed. And we also have 4 artist talk in all the different universities in Guangzhou before the opening of the exhibition. And we also commission architecture students to construct a model of the museum. And this model is put in the other classroom of and available for the public to come in, and they can use the small images we print out of the artist's work and put all those images in the space and try out the so-called curatorial experience. And that is actually all about the exhibition I curated. I spent quite a lot of time on it, and hopefully it didn't bore all of you. But I think it's a vivid example to tell you a little bit about what is my imagination of institution in China. And I will give you some other cases after this. Compared with most museums, our practice can be regarded as counter-institutional because it's not this pedagogical programs and this community-oriented events and all this kind of concept about institution are not the canonical institutional practice in China. Instead, this is an image of National Museum of China, which should be finished in the coming 5 years. And the architecture will be located right beside the bird nest. And you can see it will be an art spectacle project, which will spend millions of taxpayers' money, and also will have a big space for sculptural pieces, more or less, and also big-scale art productions. And this is the canonical, this is institution in China. This is what museums should be from a more official understanding, because this public cultural architecture have become more and more important as a representational kind of venue for the ideology and also nationalism, and also the power of the rising middle class and Chinese government is getting more aware of that. So we will expect not just new buildings of museum, gigantic museum, and also renovation of, this is Guangdong Museum of Art, renovation of some of the original museums which were not designed for spectacle, big scale, or blockbuster shows. So Guangdong Museum of Art had hosted 4 triennale, but since the shift of the director, Huang Huangsheng, to Beijing, and the whole policies and the programming of Guangdong Museum of Art has changed. So the last triennial actually announced they're going to renovate this building, which is only served for 10, 11 years, become something we don't know yet. But the last Guangzhou triennial happened in the same time of the show I curated, A Museum That Is Not. And some of the funny thing is they even commission artists to build a patch of communism on the square in front of Guangdong Museum of Art. So the whole triennial is becoming a propaganda event for local government, although it never got any funding from Guangzhou government since its beginning. But I cannot give you more examples, but this is like, both of these museums are actually what I call state-owned museums, and they're regulated directly by government, cultural bureau of the government, Guangzhou government, or the central government. They will be allocated with some fundings to build up collections, but it won't be used. It's never be used for contemporary art. It's usually for calligraphy, ink painting, or any kind of traditional media of art. And this is a picture of UCCA. It was founded by the Ullens couple. They're a private collector in 2006, I think. And after a few years of running, they actually collected quite a nice collection of works of the 89th New Wave. And also at the beginning of the founding of this institution, they make a promise to a lot of artists and tell them that they're going to develop an extensive collection of 85 New Wave. Also, will do research on this work, and will launch informative publication and also archive everything. But in last year, they actually sold, Ullens couple decided to withdraw from China. So they sold almost all the collection in an auction house. And now all this work are dispersed to private collectors and won't be accessible to the public in the coming 10, 30, 50 years. And besides state-owned museum and some of the private museum funded by collectors, there are also quite a lot of private museums had set up in the past 5 years. Also might witness a kind of boom in the coming 3 to 5 years, and every city might have a new private museum. They're mostly funded, as I mentioned before, real estate group, bank and insurance group. And this is one of the earlier ones called Today Museum. And I show this image because private museums in China, usually private funder they only give 2 to 3 years for the museums to become financially independent. And that's the worst case scenario. And then the museum will need to seek other kind of commercial sponsorship, which is not a patient culture, but a sponsorship culture. That means they are funded by luxurious brands, and also they will rent out space for PR function or fashion shows, and also to kind of release this financial pressure, museum will constantly rent out space for galleries to host solo exhibitions for the artists they represented. They would take money, not just from galleries and also from artists actually. And this is how most private museum kind of sustain. But if you do have questions about how Times Museum, I can take questions after. And I won't give more examples of private museums because now if you go to Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, or even like Chengdu, and coming maybe Wuhan, you are going to see at least 1 to 5 private museums popping up. And what is going to happen, and what are this museum going to function as an institution? What kind of art landscape and public vision they will construct is still unknown to me. So if you want to know more about, welcome to China. And beside all this more or less like big or mid-scale institution museums, there are some, because I'm aware that Canada had a long history of artists run space, and China doesn't really have, because there are no institutions, so of course there are no counter discourse or critical discourse about institutions as well. So there are self-organized and self-initiative space which are run by independent art critic or curators or artists. This is one example from Beijing called Arrow Factory, and it was initiated by Pauline Yao. She is an American art historian, but already stay in China and work actively as art critic for a lot of major magazines there. And then she initiated space in a small hutong, which is a small lane in Beijing dialect, and to reflect on the idea of a self-maintained space and its relationship with the neighborhood. In some major cities now, I also witness like self-initiative space are popping up, but compared with in the whole infrastructure, they are still relatively peripheral, and most of the program, because they don't have enough resources in terms of funding and media exposure, so it's less visible than programming of those major or big private museums. But it's usually, I think people from the art circles of our peers are usually quite interested in their activities. And besides self-initiative and self-organized space and museums, there are also independent curators and critics, which more or less belong to the same generation of me. Though they will initiate project from an independent perspective, and also try to reflect on this short art history and the infrastructure and art system in China. So this is one project curated by Carol Yinghua Lu and Liu Ding. And Carol will be one of the artistic directors of the coming Guangzhou Biennale in Korea. And Liu Ding is the artist who developed the Museum and Me piece in Times Museum as well. They work on this project called Little Movements, and they try to have to give more like a general picture of what had happened for some small self-organized exhibitions and artist group in the past 10 years in China, and also draw reference from some international projects such as Night School of Efflux and like a proposition of what might be the future of art. So as a conclusion, I would say the most constructive endeavor as being a curator in an institution in China is to propose the alternative imagination of what can be alternative imagination, also provide a platform for more like micro-political exercise for the public and for individuals. And in a way, it might be the only meaningful way to inhabit this absence of mediation. And that's all for my talk today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nikita. And we do have a bit of time for questions. Is that right?
Yeah.
You have a question?
Because I've actually been to the UCCA. I was curious, why did the Ollens family decide to move out of China?
Oh, wow. There are all kinds of gossip. And I only got the news from more or less the media. So they said like, okay, it's such a bubble. Chinese, the contemporary art market in China is such a bubble, and I'm too old, and my son, or I don't know, his son are not really interested in managing the museum, the institution. So to kind of save us the time or whatever, we'd better just sell the collection. And I think now UCC is not running by Ulan's family anymore. I think they kind of got a new funder, and they also hire a new director. But UCCA, since its founding, there are so many changes in terms of directorship and also people who work there, and it's always quite, that is the reality in China more or less, because what can be done is heavily based on who is where. And since the person or personnel change, everything can be changed. So the biggest crisis of institution in China is sustainability, because a museum only run 3 to 5 years almost cannot contribute to the public, and then cannot contribute to development of the local art echo, I would say. So we are also facing the problem of kind of have a more diverse funding system and nurture the patron culture more or less, but it's still a long reach.
Something to ask you about. I'm just curious about the term museum, because in fact there are museums in China that are historical museums, right?
Yeah.
And they have collections,
Yeah.
right? So the term museum is, and that's what seems to be strange to me, is that, and I was wondering why your place was called a museum in the first place, because they're collection-based, right?
Yeah.
That's a distinction between
Yeah.
them. Why
Yeah.
would the choice be made to call it museum?
Okay.
What does that come from? Is that from the architect and the developer and so on? And the other thing is that if that choice is made, then what does it mean about what that term, what are the expectations around that term? I mean, if it's chosen, then it's chosen in relation to what Chinese know about museum, and what they know would be those historical museums, right? And the foundation of museum is collection. So this brings me to say that your place, for instance, has no collection, right?
Yeah.
And some of the other places you show
They do
would
have.
have collections
Yeah.
based on the collector's collection. And so would those places be doing exhibitions then just from that collection?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily,
No.
because then it makes you think about then these kind of historical narratives are not being developed. Because historical narratives are developed from collections.
Yeah.
And whether they're good historical narratives or not, but they're specific historical narratives. And in a sense that all these places are, I don't know what the proportion of the ones that are collection-based and not, but the ones that are not collection-based, and if the ones that are collection-based are also just doing contemporary drawing from all these artists that are there, then these historical narratives are not being set up. So it's an interesting phenomenon that in a way maybe it's so changing all the time that there's none of these narratives are being developed or set up or proposed.
The name of Times Museum was, my guess is not from Hohanru, neither from Kuhas, it's from the developer. I think it's from Times Group. But when I got hired as curator, the name was already there. And also I think for general public, because before we kind of got recruited as the professional people to do the programming, none of those who were there had any background of art. So I think the only perception about a kind of venue for art has to be museum. There are no other terminologies available. So if the name, we got to choose the name after we got in, I will probably propose art center or ICA, whatever. Or maybe even Kunsthalle, but also that's really even less recognized in China. And some of those is difficult to be translated into Chinese. So this museum equal collection thing doesn't really exist for general public, but it's so strongly dominating in terms for the professionals. So we constantly face questions from curators or directors from other museums in China. They will ask, okay, when are you going to develop your collection? But the question is not based on this historical narrative, it's more about power. Because collection means accumulation of capital, cultural or either money. So if a museum who is not going to develop a collection, who is not interested to develop a collection, become or more or less suspicious for the professionals. Because most museums, as you asked in your question as well, private museum, they will do the programming and exhibition. Part of the purpose is to acquire collections through those exhibition and programming. So some of those work can be bought in a lower price or even maybe for free as the return of the museum hosting certain exhibitions. So either there is an insurance group from China, they call Taikang. They already developed a very, I would say, expensive collection prior to they set up a museum. But everybody knows they're going to open the museum after they have such a nice collection. But it's how to build up the capital. So I think because we talk about collection all the time, because my director faced question from the peers about collection all the time, but I kind of try to convince him not to do at the moment. Because the situation of Times Museum, now we have, Times Group is the only funder of the museum, but we have a reasonable budget for programming every year, which we can use for developing projects as such, like more educational programming and more like almost experimental compared with other museums. But to develop a collection, it will more or less become a private collection in the future. So there is no way we can kind of make sure this collection will be accessible for the public. I think we have a certain privilege to not develop a collection at the moment, but still have the name of a museum. So that's part of the reason of why I curated this show as well, because according to the history of museum, we are not a museum, but we are trying to perform as a museum in certain sense.
We have two more questions for that.
You mentioned that you've had a few local artists present in the museum.
Mm.
Could you say a little bit more about how many, roughly? Do you have an estimate of the number of local artists that you have shown? And what sort of relationships you may have with the local artists?
In my show, I think we have, no, none of them are local. At least they're not based in Guangzhou anymore. So what is our relationship of, more or less, the situation with Guangzhou is art students, and then once they become professional artists, they move to Beijing. So I would say Guangzhou might only have not more than 20 artists which age between 25 and 35. And besides, they're teachers in art academy, which teaching is the main job. And there are one Guangdong Museum of Art and then Times Museum. So our relationship with the local artists is we provide all kinds of platform and group show and proposition and also educational program which are available for younger generation of art students and provide opportunities for more like internship for students. But whether they will choose to stay in Guangzhou in the future, I'm not sure.
Thank you. Have you observed any instances where museum mandates or curatorial strategies are significantly adjusted in order to be more attractive to financial backers?
Well, sorry, I don't understand.
So you've got the situation where museums are faced with finding financial funding or survival.
Yeah.
How are museum mandates and curatorial practices responding to that?
Okay.
Do they need to change in order to?
At the moment, our museum, I think we don't have any obligation to respond to that at the moment, but a lot of art museums in China will just develop PR function exhibition together with corporations. So such as they will have a show called Dior something, and then the museum curator will kind of work as mediator or agency to call for commission from established artists from China and then put up a show, and then all the money will be paid by Dior. But this is how it kind of museums solve the problem of funding. But in our museum, we don't have any. And I don't think it's the time yet to kind of reflect on this problem because everyone playing the same game. And I don't know whether artists are willing to respond to that situation at the moment yet, because also artists have to comply with the commercial system a lot. And sometimes, and they might be able to risk being too critical. And I think maybe Alice has might have some more feeling when you were in Beijing and in China, like it's critical perspectives are something you have to develop more like subtly rather than.
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, I was going to ask a question about
Okay.
your involvement in co-founding Ping Pong Space.
Okay.
Right, as a self-organized sort of
All right.
independent
Yeah.
space, because you talked about the State Museum,
Mhm.
the Times Museum. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about Ping Pong.
At that time, it's all this like urban gentrification project is involved how to transform those warehouse area into some kind of creative industrial area. So 79A in Beijing is one of the most famous or developed example. So at that time, there is one private developer kind of offer us to help them to promote a warehouse area, which is quite small, as a creative industrial area. So we got a free space to use as an exhibition space, which is what we took as ping pong. And then we also got the opportunity to run a bar beside the space. And three of us had no idea how to kind of sustain the space but at the end we took it for only 6 to 8 months because the private developer got freaked out upon the crisis of 2008, the financial crisis. So he said no more free space anymore. So he took back the warehouse space, and then we kept the bar and run like all kinds of musical events and some small talks by artists. And at that time, it was very difficult because there are no funding at all. So we need to also, I think I work on some PR events or whatever available to make money and then kind of support our own activities. And it was really difficult. And we don't get to pay ourselves for I don't know how many months. So, and then I applied for the Apple. And now the bar ran for a longer time, but
Mm-hmm. It's a nice bar.
yeah.
One last question.
I'm sorry I came in late. I couldn't make it there. So I missed the part about Guangzhou. I don't know if you talked about the city, but it's a really transforming
Mm.
over the past decade. And it was interesting to hear you say how like a lot of really prominent Chinese artists that might have even come from Guangzhou are no longer there.
Mm.
I read a really great book that's at the Concordia Library if anyone's interested.
Mm.
It's called China Talks, and there's a French curator that interviews all these different artists
Mm.
from China. And I thought Lin Yumin was from Guangzhou.
Ling Yiling.
How do you pronounce his name?
He's was he member of the Big Tail Elephant?
I'm not sure.
Hmm.
He's more performance based.
Yeah, I think it's him. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Hmm.
But I was just surprised when you. I mean, I can understand why, but I was surprised that you were saying that most of these artists are all choosing to go to Beijing.
Yeah, because there is no a professional audience basically in Guangzhou, and because they just cannot survive in Guangzhou, and because artists in China highly rely on gallery system.
Okay.
There are just no contemporary art gallery in Guangzhou. I would say no, not one. Or maybe there was one since last year, but they were really, as long as I know, because we are all friends, it's difficult to sustain. There are no local collectors because before 2000, like a lot of Chinese contemporary collectors are actually from abroad. But after 2000, China developed quite a big market for local collectors. So they're mainly rich entrepreneurs, and we call new rich, and also quite some celebrities, and also mainly, and they collect. They have a big, quite sustainable commercial art gallery system in Beijing, and most of the institutions you might even hear about outside of China, such as Long March, Vitamin Creative Space, or which other? They're actually commercial galleries. Also Shang Art, they're commercial galleries. And those artists, if they want to work as full-time artists, they have to leave Guangzhou. And museum, if for new commissions or productions in the museum, I can provide, of course, production fee for the artists. They can create new work. I can pay a small amount of artist fee, which is not such a big thing. And besides that, they have nowhere to have income.
I guess I don't know the amount and stuff. I guess I thought it would be an asset to come from another city, just so that not everyone's from Beijing, but at least to recognize themselves that this is their origin.
But Beijing has artists from everywhere. I mean, artists from Sichuan, from Hubei, they all go to Beijing. It's almost unavoidable, but also Guangzhou, now because we only opened in the end of 2010, and we are starting to kind of provide or work more with local artists, but it takes a long time to also keep them here or give them confidence that there is something happening here in Guangzhou. Before, everyone needs to go to Beijing to actually realize something, to achieve something. And now we're working on it, but it will take some time. And also, students who graduate from art academy, because there is no studio art practice, more or less. It's more, and all the students, like, they study sketches and oil painting and maybe sculpture, really media based.
Thank you. Yeah, and definitely, I mean, I think part of the Guangzhou Triennale's vision, if you will, and also the Times Museum is about seeing that sort of long-term development, if you will, or turn the attention to art in Guangzhou as a triangulation of Beijing and Shanghai long centers. So thank you for your questions. Thank you, Nikita, for a wonderful talk.